A revised $23 billion settlement for children and families harmed by Ottawa's underfunding of on-reserve services is going to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Now, that's after the Assembly of First Nations approved the compensation package, which Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu is calling the largest settlement in Canadian history. The revised deal includes another $3 billion to compensate the 13,000 children left out of the initial agreement. Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse is urging Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to adhere to the AFN's call to make a formal apology to the plaintiffs and victims involved. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this settlement and the experiences of First Nations children in Canada's child welfare system is Miss Mary Teegee, Chair of the Indigenous Child and Family Services Directors Forum. Miss Teegee, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
So quite the complicated issue to unpack in just a few minutes, ma'am. But let's start with what this settlement means for the children and the families that were affected by this underfunding of on-reserve services. What sort of compensation they can expect, and would this new revised funding be enough to cover all those affected?
Well, the revised settlement actually is covering the ones that were left out of the initial $20 billion settlement that was proposed by Canada. The First Nations Caring Society, which I'm a member about, and of course, Executive Director Cindy Blackstock is our phenomenal leader. The the extra 3.4 billion almost is to cover those ones that were in a federally funded placement, or that was in a non-ISC funded placement. So they would have been removed from their families and then placed with friends, and they weren't covered under the settlement. So we had to revise it to ensure that all children that were entitled to the original Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders that we won in 2016 were actually covered.
And what would this sort of compensation look like for all those involved? What could they expect from this?
Well, the compensation as per the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, where this stems from, you have to remember that we won the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in 26, and then there was a class action later. So all of the victims we had always stated that the CHRT, the tribunal, had ordered that $40,000 be paid to all the victims of the discrimination, including like the children and the caregivers of those children and the deceased. So they would minimally get 40,000 for the time of the tribunal orders.
All right, ma'am. And for some more of a human perspective to this story, can you share with us the experiences of residential school and 60 Scoop survivors when it comes to the child welfare system in particular?
Well, I think there's a link that I think Canadians need to know. That there's this sort of this a stereotype that Indigenous there's so many Indigenous children because we were just not good parents. That's not the reality. When children were removed at the young age of 3 or 4 and were raised within a institution and raised by vindictive and really horrible people, the nuns and the priests and whatnot, and they were raised and they weren't parented properly. There were issues of abuses, all types of abuses, spiritual, physical, sexual, all these types of abuses. And they were expected to themselves, when they got older, to be parenting when they were trying to self-medicate in some cases. So it's very closely linked to what has happened to the residential school, at the residential school. So I think when we look at that, it's really the compensation is really important, that Canada acknowledges the hurt and pain that comes from the children and the families that were in the system and were underfunded for many years and discriminated against. Added to that, the impacts of residential school, there's a long way for reconciliation and a long way to go for healing.
A long way indeed. Now, taking all of this into consideration, what is the current state of Canada's foster system? We know right now 53.8% of children in this foster system are Indigenous children, even though they make up just 7.7% of the entire child population. So has there been any improvement since all of this attention has been put on this issue?
Well, we don't really actually have the numbers right now since 2016. Like, have the rates gone down? We really don't know, but definitely I do know anecdotally from the agency that I work for. I'm the executive director of Carriage County Family Services for Child and Family, that we definitely know that there's more money there to prevent children going into care. And that was really what the case was about. There was money to keep children in care at the actual cost, but there was no money to prevent children going into care. So now that we have monies to provide like culture camps, just the basic necessities for families to keep their children with them. One of the main issues, if not the issue, for children going into care is because of issues of poverty. And with the prevention dollars that we are now awarded through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, we're able to provide those preventative services to keep children with their parents and in their communities where they belong. And so definitely there has been a increase in preventative services across the country.
All right, Ms. Teegee, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you again for joining us today and providing us with some more clarity on this very important issue.
You're welcome.